democratic energy emerging among Roma, but also very powerful movements that Rio was working very closely with, emerged in the last couple of years. And this is where I would end maybe just these initial thoughts. But yes, there were many bad things that happened and many impacts at the societal, political, and also institutional level. But we have also seen incredible energy that emerged as a very powerful movement that I believe will have to sustain the pressure as we go in these new times.
Thanks, Mensur. I love that idea, never waste a good crisis. And it seems that's exactly what's happened here. And I think, what we want to do today is not just focus on the problems, but focus on what needs to be done, how people have responded, because we haven't just been sitting back looking at the news for the last 4 years, we've been getting involved. So that's a good note to start us off on. And I think it brings us up to 2020, obviously, and to the elections themselves. And some of those comparisons that I mentioned at the beginning, clearly there are many differences between Black communities in the US and Roma. But for a moment, I think it's worth dwelling on some of the overlap, some of the similarities, and what might we draw from them. And Kinga, maybe you could start us off on that.
Sure, happy to, Eleanor. Also, welcome to our audience. It's great to be in this conversation. So maybe what I will do at the beginning is just to lay out a little bit the data that we have from the US, and then connect it to the present situation. And as we go on, it will also connect to what Mensur just told us. So what we know is that in this election in 2020, 16% more people in the US went out to vote. And in some states like Georgia, it was actually up to 21% more people. This is, of course, largely due to the fact that Black voters were heavily mobilized. 90% of Black women and 79% of Black men voted for the Democratic candidate. We also know that the younger demographics voted overwhelmingly for Biden, and he was also able to move the independent, the swing voters closer to his ideology. 54% of those voted for Biden. Many of those, over 90% of those who went for the Democratic candidate, considered themselves economically challenged or poor. And it's also true, however, that while many people voted for Biden, many of those voted on him because they were voting against Trump. And it's also interesting to bring in the Latino community perspective, which is they are presently the largest minority voting bloc in the US, and therefore a very strong political group. Their votes were not so overwhelmingly on the Democratic candidate, and about 2/3 of them went for Biden, the other 1/3 for Trump. What's interesting there is that almost 90% of all Latino voters still see Trump as favorable, and his approval rate is very high with the Latino community. Now, what does all this data tell us, right? And how is this relevant to voting and Roma votes in Europe? And a few thoughts on this. First of all, perhaps the obvious one, but I don't think it can be said enough many times, that voting matters. And if you have the power to vote and you don't use it, somebody else will do it, and they will speak on your behalf or on our behalf. Also, voting matters, and it matters because funding is ascribed to what issues get funded, where the attention of the decision makers and the politicians go. It does depend on what issues get voted on. And of course, the gain we're talking about now is the gain in the US, but I still think it offers a huge opportunity for minorities, including, of course, Roma in Europe, the largest minority in Europe. the Biden...
Can I just come in? Can I come in there for a moment? Because I think you've picked up on a really interesting theme. And that's, you talked about the Latino vote in the US, something people have analysed a lot. And, they've come to the understanding it's not a block, a monolithic block. There's a lot of diversity within that community. Equally, there's a really interesting stat that says, actually the vote for Trump among Black men went up. So, you have to kind of test this assumption that simply by mobilizing a minority vote that they are going to vote for someone who will work ostensibly in their interests. Now, I wonder, is that a phenomenon that is a reality for Roma communities in Europe? Is it a very diverse community? Is there a very diverse vote? And equally, is there also the phenomenon where Roma communities might get behind a populist leader who isn't necessarily acting in their interest? And I open that out to the whole panel. If anybody wants to jump in, please do.
Absolutely, Eleanor. I mean, it is the case with Roma community, as it is with Latino communities, and any ethnic community it should be, that the votes are not monolithic. And at the end of the day, sure, Biden and Harris won because many of the people they work with were able to mobilize the minority votes, right? Especially Black women, actually. And this was possible because of the credibility and the legitimacy of the actors involved, those who lead key Black movements in the US, like Black Lives Matter and hashtag Win with Black Women, which is a group led by 200 very influential Black female leaders. And to connect this, right, to our countries. So there is a large block of Roma voters all across Europe. And we have legitimate and credible leaders, and there are several important and active movements. However, their voices are still often on the lower burner. And the point, of course, is that what is good for minorities is good for the larger society. What is good for Roma is good for the larger societies here. But we have to make sure that their voices are heard. And then, of course, there's another problem of whom they can vote for, and whether there is a credible opposition or any opposition in some cases, like we have it in Hungary, right, where the opposition is extremely weak and fragmented. So they're not, it's very difficult for anybody to be voting. So
thank you.
Let me stop there.
Yeah, that's great. That's a good opener on that topic. And I want to bring in Neda and Zeljko, who have been listening to all of this. Do you want to share any comments on this or any other themes we've touched on? Neda, maybe start with you.
Thanks, Eleanor. Thanks, everyone. Happy to join the debate. Let me just put two additional thoughts on this. I think, first of all, is the topic of racial justice, right? And what are the issues high on the agenda that are directly connected to the racism against the Black community in the US? We haven't seen this in Europe, in none of the countries, even in countries where the voting bloc of Roma is much bigger than the Black vote in the USA. Although majority of Europeans in all of the surveys that are constantly done by the EU recognize that the racism against Roma is widespread in their country. This issue, as a political issue, hasn't been on the political agenda on major political parties, and hasn't been an issue to actually mobilize the Roma votes. The approach of the political parties now, of course, I'm generalizing, but kind of the predominant approach was towards vote manipulation, vote buying, really using the public services to condition votes of Roma, to threaten votes of Roma, etc. So we've seen a different treatment of the Roma vote in Europe, and I think I'm glad that, especially in the past years, there is a strong Roma movement across Europe that is actually repositioning Roma community and asking for not just negotiation, but really elevating the issues, the problems, and putting them on the political agenda at local election, national election, and European election. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Neda. Zeljko, waiting patiently. Please come in.
Well, I will just build on really valuable points of my colleagues. I think Mensur's starting point was that in 2006, when Trump won, we expected and we've seen higher degree of polarization and conflict and animosity. And in the European context, all those that were traditionally and actively, aggressively against the Roma, they were encouraged, emboldened by Trump. At the same time, I would say that now that Trump lost and that he is defiant in accepting that he lost, he's sending a signal, as Ivan Krastev recently said, he's sending a signal to the far right and populists across the globe, as well as in Europe, that this is a life and death situation for them. So we can expect that this conflict and polarization and attacks on the Roma will be even more aggressive, because this is the last card and sometimes the first card that far right and populists play. I think the point that Kinga and Neda also made is very deep one when you put them together, that voting matters, and that if we want that anti-racism becomes a political program of candidates and becomes a political agenda of governments, voting really matters, especially among the minority communities, because let's be quite frank, Biden was already in the White House, and those who are on the same side of politics of Biden in Europe, progressives, center-left, center-left, Greens, were already in power in different ways, but they never prioritized anti-racism, let alone they never prioritized pro-Roma policies. So we should not take it for granted that Biden and his friends in Europe will be automatically, just because Trump is not there, be pro-racist, pro-anti-racist, pro-human rights, pro-Roma. This is just a different environment in which we have to vote, and we can vote, and we do vote as we did in the past. So we have to organize to vote in our interest. Our vote is manipulated. We've seen, as Kinga said, in Hungary, for example, Roma do predominantly vote for Orban, not only because there are no alternatives, but because Orban manipulates them through the public work schemes, through different forms of co-optation and intimidation. This is happening also in Bulgaria, in Romania, and so on. And what we have to do as a community is get into better organized voting. Otherwise, we end up in the dilemma that Macron has now in France. Macron now, because he's under the pressure from far right, he rather goes into taking the votes from Le Pen, from the far right, with his rhetorics, because he believes he cannot count on the votes of the Roma in France, black French citizens, Muslim French citizens, and so on. So even when there are politicians who might support our agenda, we need to be there to be a powerful constituency, so they don't go after the vote of the racist people, after the racist politics, and so on.
Yeah, thanks, Zeljko. Yeah, and I think it's a powerful point, this idea that, democracy is a two-way process, right? It's not just waiting to see what people will do for us, but equally what we need to do on our side. And, I'm struck that some people listening in today might not be as immersed in the Roma scene in Europe, and you've all said voting matters. I wonder if we could just touch for a moment on what do we actually know about Roma participation and voting in Europe at the moment? You've mentioned some examples from Hungary, from Bulgaria. Mensur, maybe could you come in for a moment just on where that currently stands?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, politics, among the other things, is about numbers. So, historically, we have been undercounted in all previous censuses, let's say, in more than 120 years across all European countries, candidate countries, and potential countries to the European Union. Just to give you some idea, we have been undercounted by 5 times in the EU member states. by 20 times in the EU candidate states and about 2 times in the EU potential candidate countries. That, to give you an idea with the numbers, so in the European Union, we are counted 5 million less, 3.5 millions in the candidate countries and about 50,000 people in potential candidate countries. So instead of 12 million, which is widely known and accepted, estimated, not official, but estimated number of Roma, we can argue of a much higher number, if, you know, at least for the 30-40%, because of many reasons, because we are young population and because of our natural demographic increase, we are growing significantly in Europe. Now, to give you some idea, maybe the best idea might be to think that in some countries where Roma represent, let's say, more than 5 or 10%, like it is the case in Bulgaria, or it is the case in Romania, or it is the case in Hungary, Slovakia, and some of the Balkan countries like Serbia and Macedonia, Roma vote really matters because it can be a swing vote, not only for the settlement or municipal or county level elections, but also at the national level elections. And because of the political systems as we have them, very broken, with so many parties competing and contesting, unlike in the US with 2 big parties and polarization, there is, I would say, much more diversity when it comes to political parties in most of the countries where we work. Roma vote really matters. Neda explained there are many issues that we have to address. Ourselves, but also some of the issues that needs to be addressed institutionally. But that's what matters in the 2019 European Parliament elections. And building on what Neda said, you asked the question, whether Roma are a unified block of voters. We are not a monolithic community, unlike all the other communities across Europe. We are very diverse, and we are very proud of that, but also very unified community against fascism. Very unified community against all the enemies of Roma, historical enemies of Roma in Europe. So Roma know what they are voting for and what they should not be voting for, and that's an important thing. Of course, under significant political or organized pressure and violence, like it is the case in Bulgaria or Hungary or Slovakia, of course, people have no free choice to make their mind about whom they want to select. Elections are known in these countries even before elections happening. Yeah, so this is why that is an important point to make, that Roma are diverse but a unified community when it comes to voting against enemies of Roma. And last point on the, if you look at the hard data we have been collecting ourselves with people that we have been working in the elections, so important European Parliament elections. This is where we demonstrated actually what we speak with you now, because in each country where we worked, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Hungary, in Slovakia, we have recorded 2 things. One thing, significant increase of Roma voter turnout comparing to the majority. You know that the voter turnout in European Parliament elections is quite low. It was going all down since 79, and then it increased again in 2019. And we had a great contribution to that, because we could analyze that in between 7 to 25% of Roma were got out to vote more than non-Roma in the European Parliament elections. That's one point. Second point, when you look at the demography of those who were elected in the European Parliament, we have also contributed greatly to support those that are pro-European, pro-social cohesion, and pro-equality candidates. And why is that important? If you look at the regions in Europe, if you look at the regions, I mean, northern region and western and southern and central eastern region, majority of Roma live in Central European countries, and this is why our vote matters. Especially in the weak conditions of democracy and democratic institutions, this is where we are mostly populated, and of course, you know, our role is to strengthen self-organization even more than what we have done in 2019. But certainly, we had a great contribution that we have less far-right nationalists and Eurosceptics in the European Parliament.
Great. Thank you, Mensur. That's lots to take in. So maybe what we'll do is pause, and we actually have some videos from other contributors who have sent in some thoughts. So let's start with one of them. We have Jose Heredia Moreno, who is the director of Camalamos in Spain. So if my colleague can please play Jose's video first. Thank you.
The Trump presidency has put on top of the political agenda the defense of democracy. Trump's presidency has brought conservative values in the US to a very deep crisis. And it's exactly what is happening in Europe in the last 20 years. Whenever conservative parties have tried to compete or to alliance with far-right parties, conservative values and conservative parties have gone to crisis, and democracies have been deeply weakened. We can address conservative parties and liberal parties in Europe, trying to make them understand that the defense of democracy requires the defense of minority rights, the empowerment of minorities, and the marginalization of far-right in the political arena.
Great, thank you. And apologies that Jose's face, if it was for me anyway, was a little covered there, but bear with us. We're getting better at these events. And the second video is from Cyprian Nekula, who is coordinator of platform Aracel. So can we play Cyprian's video, please? We'll just give it a moment. Bear with us. Okay, well, maybe we'll take a few more questions and a few more, lots to discuss, and we'll come back to Cyprian's video in a moment. So we've gone over many aspects of the influence of the elections in terms of elections for Roma in Europe, but maybe let's kind of broaden the view a little bit now to the impact of the US elections on, on society and the lasting impacts that they might have. I mentioned at the start that misinformation, disinformation continues to plumb new depths. It's not going away, and it's something that Roma in Europe have had to deal with as well. There's also this anti-elite narrative, which is an issue. And I'm wondering if, some of our colleagues here and some of the activists listening have confronted that as well in their own advocacy, and if they're falling victim to that idea. So there's a lot to discuss and unpack there around trust and its implications on society. And Zeljko, can I bring you in to share some opening thoughts on those themes?
Yes, I think Trump has pushed the polarization in politics, lying in politics, manipulation in politics to the extreme, and has shown how the mistrust, vulgarity, sensationalism, scandals, fear-mongering, demagogy, but also use of faith, for example, evangelical communities, how they supported Trump just because of for example, his stand on abortion or stand on same-sex marriages. forgetting that he also stands against human rights, against equality, and so on. And also the way the media polarization and commercialization was also pushed to the extreme. And COVID showed to us how the politicians in power who base their work on incompetence, but popularity, also on lies versus facts, how they can make decisions that actually cause dramatic loss of lives. So what does it mean for us in our context? It means that we have seen that kind of populist demagogic approach also infected some, not too many, but some among the Roma communities too. We have also now demagogues and kind of populists among the Roma who attack people with education, people in different positions, whether they are in NGOs or in government, but people who rely on competence and professional skills. They attack them as elites. We also see that those people work closely with populists and far right from the mainstream, although this is kind of paradoxical because the far right stands against minorities and so on. So the lesson learned for us as activists and advocates is that we have to work with people who are not activists and advocates among the Roma communities, because if we leave this space, there is a vacuum that immediately populists and far right will use. And I think the role of journalism, serious, credible journalism and media plays a huge role, because I think we as a foundation also made a mistake many years ago to discontinue supporting Roma media and journalism among the Roma. That's why there is this vacuum space now filled up by anybody who just has whatever to say, opens Facebook video and just spreads lies. This is what we see in Roma communities as an infection from the mainstream politics, the infection from the mainstream environment. Trump just pushed this to the extreme, but I think the Biden's victory shows that facts, knowledge, and competence, decency, can win elections if we commit ourselves to work with people who are not necessarily involved in politics, who are not necessarily activists.
Thanks, Zeljko. And just some of the comments coming in, it's interesting, they echo some of this. One person says, many Roma in France vote for Le Pen. Someone else says, isn't this a clash between progressive and conservative thinking, regardless of race and origin? And it's interesting to see, some of the broader phenomena in happenings at a societal level and how they affect the Roma community. Now, maybe we'll try our video again, because we've got some great content. I want to make sure we have time to play it. So if we can go back to Cyprian and see if we are able to play his video, we'll give it another go. So if my colleague could play that, we'll see.
Donald Trump lost the elections in the US, and that was the reason to celebrate for many of my friends around Europe. I have friends that open bottles of wine and dance, some of them on Mahalalai Banda rhythms. I was also happy that this era ended. However, after the euphoric period, I've been thinking that so many people still voted for what Trump represented, and that's a problem to me. How on earth is possible that so many Americans, after 4 years mandate of this president, still voted for Trump? Well, that's a danger that we should consider further in our activities. In Europe, it's the same situation. We have populists in power for so many years, and without the mobilization of people that recognize the problem of our societies, it wouldn't make a change. For instance, the discourse on national minorities is not going to affect only that national minority, but all of our society as a whole. Therefore, I think for us, for Roma, it will be an important step forward to organize ourselves and to be capable to mobilize other people around our project, that it's for the good of our societies.
Great, thank you. Good to have that input. Any comments from the panel on anything Cyprian said there? Do you want to pick up on it? Just jump in.
If I can come in, thanks, Eleanor. I think two things are important that were echoed both by Cyprian and by Pepe. I think one is the stance of Europe on the democracy and how do we defend the democratic values. And the second is on the polarization of the society, what it means, and what the Cyprian was referring to the danger. On the defense of the democracy, I think it's important for Europe to actually partner with Biden and his election pledge that he will host a summit on democracy in the first year while he's in office. And I think while the European Union will join that summit, right, per se, Europe is not a club of democracies as we've seen in the past years. And the debate on democracy is not as vivid as some of the other US-EU issues, such as the defense spending or the relationship with China and Russia. And I think this is crucial. And it's very important that Roma as well push for this redefinition of what actually needs to be done to defend democracy. And I think you touched upon with the misinformation and the regulation, and it's good that at least some of the EU representatives are now reflecting on this and calling on this as well. And the upcoming legislation on the Digital Act should even furthermore regulate this sphere. But I think this is not a done deal. It hasn't been discussed at the level, and as many Roma experience across Europe, the dysfunctionality of the European democracy on their shoulders in their everyday struggles, I think the Roma movement is especially well positioned to contribute to this debate, not just as a question of representation of minorities or fighting online hate, and using basically riding on the anti-Roma hatred to increase the support for the far right, but much more in terms of dysfunctionalities of the system. And I'm happy that we have the translational network to contribute to that. But as Zeljko said, as Cyprian warned, this is not a done deal. The win of Biden, although it was a kind of welcomed across Europe, is and we can have some kind of a hope for the period. It's not guaranteed that it will improve the life, because the previous presidency of Biden and Obama basically was overlapping with the Roma decade, and we saw that the situation of Roma did not improve significantly. So I think the lesson for us is use these new sparks of hope, use the reflection of the past 4 years, especially in the American society, about what it means when you are not looking into the marginalized part of the societies, on the losing sort of end of societies, or those that think that they are losing end of societies, and really plug in now in the debate as we are repositioning the US-EU relationship.
Thank you, Neda. Kinga, do you want to come in?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Eleanor. So continuing exactly on those thoughts and reflecting also on the video, we certainly know that those who support and continue to support Trump and practice Trumpism, Orbanism, you name it, do not simply go away with the elections, right? It's usually not the case that authoritarian leaders leave the ballot box. And I'm thinking here, of course, more of, let's say, Latin American examples where there's a whole history of autocratic populism. And we only know of, let's say, 2 presidents since the 1980s who lost elections. The rest won the popular vote, and they only abandoned their post under military pressure in case of Morales, right, or societal pressure in Peru. But the point I want to make that it is possible to contain this authoritarian-leaning populism, and the way to do it, besides voter mobilization, is party work, right? And there's something else that the U.S. of course was able to do, and Zeljko was talking about this, and that is to maintain the rule of law and a strong and impartial judiciary and civil society and free press. I think countries like Poland and Hungary certainly had a strong ally in Trump, which is sort of over now, right? And as we heard from the government itself in Hungary, they don't have a plan B. But another point is that both Trump and Orban base their strategies on creating fear, and that doesn't go away. They will continue to insinuate fear and sell themselves as the protectors, etc. So when Trump talks about rigged elections, right, which he has quite a lot, he doesn't necessarily mean technically those elections were rigged, right? He refers more to the wrong type of people being allowed to register to vote. And in our countries, right, too often we see the case that while Roma are not technically suppressed, for not being allowed to vote, but rather their votes are bought by political parties, and this is a very real phenomenon. And I think it's something that we all need to pay more attention to.
So I'm just going to push you a bit there. We can pay attention to it, but what else can we do? Neda?
Yes, let me just add something, Eleanor. And unlike in the US, where the win of Biden also means basically replacement of key positions and a huge administration, in Europe this is not the case, because the ruling of conservative, of far-right or autocratic regimes really influences the civil service, which stays long after those are outset of power, as we've seen, and works against the progressive, let's say, that will come in power, as we've seen in the case of North Macedonia. So going back to the point that what can be done, I think Mensur said the autocratic tendencies that we've seen in the Central and Eastern Europe are the societies where the Roma vote is very strong, but the progressive politicians have not been targeting and elevating the issues of Roma, so they can actually gain the support at the level that it's needed, and to push for not just democratization of the societies and improvement of the democracies, but really basically saving these economies as well, because of the migration and because of the demographic decline on the rest of the population. And I think now this election and the topics that have been opened in the US and the level of reflection that was brought could be a potential that the Roma movement can use it.
Thank you, Neda. I'm seeing lots of hands up, but I'd want to move us on to the next theme. It's great that we're all fully mobilized here, and we want to talk about the impact on policy. And I'll just mention a question that's come in, which is a good transition, I think. And it says, for US society and globally, Europe is no longer a hotspot. What interests do US leaders have in demanding change for Roma in Europe? What incentives do European leaders have to comply with US demands? So, I mean, let's take that question as the jumping off point for the impact of policy that flows from the elections on Roma in Europe. Because I know when I saw this theme, I thought, how can that possibly connect to, a Roma community in rural Hungary? So maybe, Zeljko, can you kick us off and just join the dots a little bit for us and comment on that?
Yes, I think even during Obama's time, we have seen decrease in the interest of the US in Europe, especially after the dispute with Russia about the missile shield in central northern Europe. But it still doesn't mean that the US have interest to completely forget about Europe. And the interest today, for example, is the Paris Agreement that was spearheaded by France and led to an unprecedented agreement on the climate change and what governments have to do. And that's where I think France is seen as a very strong counterpart, an important counterpart. Of course, during the Trump's time, US withdrew from that, of course, because of the strong influence of financial sector and lobbies on Trump. I think the second is certainly the security concerns about Russia, and I think the war in Ukraine just showed once more to the US how fragile Europe is to Russia. So I think Biden has a very different stand vis-a-vis Russia and Russian influence in Europe, and that's going to be important for the foreign policy of the US, and that's what I think again will increase the attacks on Roma, because Russia has a very strong allies in Europe in populist and far-right parties for whom Roma are regularly a target of scapegoating and instilling fear in the majority population. So I think there is an implication, but I think there is a bigger one when it comes to the Central Eastern Europe. You know, unlike the US, in Central Eastern Europe, the public institutions are very politicized, and especially institutions related to elections are very politicized. So even if Roma organized, even if there is as Kinga said, plan B, an alternative to Orban, the conditions in which elections are happening are something that we have to work on. For us, for Roma to be free to organize and think our own way, we need to have more credible media, we need to have protection of our voters, and so on. For our vote to be counted, we need to have very strong independent electoral commissions that make sure that every vote counts. This is what, for me, these elections in the US are a big story about. Not necessarily about the victory of Biden, but victory of impartial, strong, credible institutions that made sure that voters' right to vote and the votes of the voters really count, even if the most powerful public official on earth, the President of the United States, wants to have a different result. They resisted. And for me, Europeans do not necessarily prioritize the elections and electoral administration, electoral policies right now because of different concerns. I think that's a mistake, and that's something that if there is an agenda that we Roma need to stand up, precisely because our vote can matter and we are attacked in the times of elections. In our advocacy agenda, we need to advocate for the reform and strengthening of electoral institutions to ensure that our elections are free and fair.
Thank you, Zeljko. I want to just hop to another video because we've got some great contributions I want to be sure to include. So I think next up is Nikolai Kirilov from Bulgaria, the Roma Standing Conference in Bulgaria. So if my colleague could please play Nikolai's contribution.
Never before the election in the US have been observed with such interest by members of the Roma community for several reasons. Concern. Nationalists who are part of the government of our country give us example of the Trump's attitudes toward minorities and use as excuse when they had anti-Roma position and policies. This was also seen in the contestation of the election. Shaking faith in the democratic instrument is the key tool for the far rights and the patriots groups during the election. Roma leadership have been fighting for years against electoral manipulation and repression against the Roma community during the election. Disinformation. This channel overlapped with the channel with anti-Roma rhetorics and imposing the conspiracy theory. Expectation. The Roma community hopes that the new president of the US, Mr. Biden, will return the role of the US to the establishment of the democratic values of our countries. We hope that the most important asset, the export of the democracy, will return. We hope to receive the necessary support, the Roma, to fight for our place and role in the development of our countries.
That's great. So great, interesting to hear Nikolai echoing some of what you said, Zeljko, about the shaking faith in democratic institutions being one of the most important factors of what went on. I think while we're on our video, let's go to another one, and then I'm coming back to the panel. So get ready. Diana Pavlovic, we have a video from Diana. Diana is leader of the Movimento Kitana in Italy. So we'll play that now.
I think that results of USA elections can make us imagine that the sovereignist international project, as Steve Bannon wanted it, is failing. And it means at least that in Europe in the next period, sovereignists, populists, and the nationalists will be weaker, at least weaker. And this doesn't mean that they can't count still on big numbers of supporters all over the Europe, but however, this weakness can give us better opportunity to work with the democratic institutions, European and national institutions, on how to imagine the medium, long-term project for Roma progress. And it doesn't mean, of course, that the life of Roma will change from today to tomorrow for all difficulties they are suffering and all discrimination they are suffering this moment. But for us as a movement, politically, is a good opportunity because we will have weaker opponents and enemies.
Good. So Kinga, Mensur, I'd love to bring you in to comment on some of what maybe Diana has said or thoughts before. So Kinga, why don't you start?
Absolutely, I can connect to what Nikki was saying and bring in perhaps the expectations, right, from Biden. And I think here it's worth talking about perhaps the expected re-engagement or reinvestment in transatlantic relations. I think Biden is probably the most transatlantic person in the U.S. as head of U.S. administration in some time now. He has long ties with Europe, and I think there are plenty of opportunities for cooperation. And first and foremost, I would say the rule of law, which right now is EU's mess, right? So perhaps, the U.S. showing a role in re-emphasizing why and how international law and not just the national law is important will be helpful for Roma. I think Orban and the alike expect conflict with this administration, but my point here is that while changes in the US offer us opportunities, right, many of us, it also depends on what can happen in the national settings. And of course, we cannot expect Roma to be, solving huge societal issues. And we talked already about the fragmented opposition, but there is also this whole issue of attention to human rights and rule of law. And I think even in countries like Hungary, there is a large constituency who still finds the importance of the rule of law and human rights important, but it doesn't necessarily translate into support for Roma or, simply being pro-Roma. And I think that strengthening the bilateral relationships where that is possible and the presence of the US embassies on issues that are important to Roma will also be or should be significant under the Biden administration. And here I think, of course, of in many of the countries we work with, the US embassies have been very helpful over the years in picking up and raising issues that are relevant to the larger society, but specifically to the Roma as well. Anything from human rights to housing and healthcare and employment. Many of these relationships have changed, deteriorated during the Trump administration, as these issues were not on their agenda, right? So based on what we know so far about Biden's view about, importance of rule of law and racial equity in the US, I think we expect a renewed presence and leadership by the US embassies with a clear focus on some of these issues.
Thank you, Kinga. I'm just going to read quickly a comment that came in before I go to Mensur. It says, if you look at elections of members of the US Congress who are not centrist but progressives, they won by very wide margins. Centrist candidates like Biden won by small majorities. I think we need to keep in mind that just voting against a racist is not a very passionate reason to vote for the other candidate. So candidates with real vision attracted voters. So I think that's an interesting point to keep in mind. Mensur, come in.
There are many interesting points, but I'll try to pick on some of those that I think we could elaborate a bit more on Zeljko's point on people versus elite, and your question on what we can do more. I mean, when there are lies, we have to tell more truths. That would, the logic suggests. So how we do that more effectively using the information technology and all possibilities we have these days, I think is one of the potential response. That many more people tell the truth than the lie. Of course, there are now scientists suggesting that the lie spreads much quicker and it is more effective. But I think, again, there are many more good angels that can tell the truth, and we should encourage and protect this kind of voices. On the majority rule topic, we obviously, as a Roma-led program, will have to reconsider existing institutional minority protection mechanisms. I mean, for us, they have been there for about 20, 30 years, and Hungary promotes one of their best model of minority self-government as the best model for minority representation. While the idea was good at the beginning, it has become an politically instrumentalized weapon that works very much against Roma and the interest of Roma. So what I liked about Kinga's point on the international law and the rule of law or rule-based governance in Europe, that's essential, I think, for us, especially as we spend significant efforts and have many friends and allies that supports us to make progress at the European level. And then when we are expected to translate these policies and resources back at home, then the corruption eats them. I mean, the more money Europe allocates for Roma in Central European countries, the more opportunities for corruption increases. So that's why establishing, such institutional norms and impartiality, as Zeljko spoke, I think is going to be essential. But where I would like us to maybe just focus a bit more is the question that Zeljko asked at the topic Zeljko raised at the beginning, and it is the question of Diana also has high hopes, and many of our activists, and I want us to just contest this idea. Is it really getting back to normal? Especially for us, like Roma in Europe, but also for many ethnic and other minorities in Europe. Because look, many people think with Trump gone and eventually also imprisoned, we can go back to semblance and decency and normalcy, But I personally think that normalcy is dangerous, as it helps facilitate Trumpism. And this goes really deep, both in the US and the Europe. The neoliberal conditions that caused neo-fascist Trumpism. The idea now that somehow with the Trump gone, we can go back to normal, where the normal conditions actually constituted the conditions that were prerequisites for neo-fascist backlash. So I think we have to really question that idea and instead think if there is an increase or rise in authoritarianism in Europe, and I'm not talking only in the last 4 years with the election of Trump, it has been recorded, at least it has been statistically recorded in the last 40 years, since 80s. It was marginal in 80s and it rose to 26.8% in the last 40 years. Of course, it got some supersonic speed in the last 4 years, but it is much longer in the historical perspective. So first is that idea to understand that if the issues like in the US of systemic poverty and racism are not addressed, I mean, for us, going back to normal means death. So we cannot go back to normal. So when, if we are faced with a state with strong muscle, to put it this way, we need more democracy. So when democracy in crisis, we need more democracy, not something else. So that's something that I would like to go back to that question of what that going back to normal or post-Trump looks like.
Thank you, Mensur. Yeah, point well made. Neda, would you like to come in?
Yes, let me also comment on the videos and the comment from the audience, especially that the Europe is not hotspot for the US. I think 2 points there I wanted to make, and it's one on the Trump actually didn't treat the European Union as a union, right? But cherry-picked and kind of established and supported direct relationship with certain countries such as Poland, Hungary, and I think the now being Biden coming to presidency, I think it's almost certain that they will treat the European Union as a union, and I think they could reinforce the progressive forces, especially on the rule of law, etc., and kind of disempower some of the autocratic voices. I think the second is on the Western Balkans. I think US has been traditionally very much involved in the Western Balkans, seemingly under protecting the minority agenda, but we have seen in Kosovo and in Bosnia that Roma were on the losing end, either with no right for political representation at the federal level, or without actually being taken care as victims in the Kosovo conflict. So I think US will not want to still be a police kind of in the region, and will expect for Europe to step up its forces. And I think what is happening now with the Bulgarian veto on North Macedonia is something that is unacceptable both for the US, and should be something that the European leaders take a much stronger voice. And I think the third, what we can expect is actually a leadership on the very important issue, which is for the democratic voters, the most important issue, which is the health insurance. And during the pandemic, the leadership of the US in intergovernmental institutions, but also on the vaccination process would be crucial. And here I want to flag something that we researched going back to the public administration, where our findings through the Gallup study that we did show that health professionals especially are the ones that most discriminate against Roma compared to teachers and social workers. And we've measured, and it was an experimental design, and an enormous empathy gap when it comes to Roma and non-Roma in a professional setting. So, for instance, if a Roma waits for more than 1 hour for emergency help, or if they need to encounter costs which are not covered by the statutory cost. And I think this opens the question of how Roma have been treated, and we know from the experience badly during the pandemic, but most importantly now with the vaccination and as the pandemic is prolonged, what would be the resolution. I think this is a key issue for Roma, and hopefully a more just sort of leadership and equity from the US on this issue will trickle down to Roma communities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for bringing that up, Neda, because I'm struck, as much as two 70-plus-year-old men in the US might affect us here in Europe, one thing that's certainly affecting us is the coronavirus and how, as you say, the vaccination program will be rolled out. And I wanted to pick up on that. You've raised some important points about biases in healthcare system and how that might affect the Roma communities and their access to a vaccine. I wonder, do any of the other panelists want to come in on that? Either what kind of leadership role the US could play to try and avert some of these problems or to change them, or indeed just the issue more generally and how it will affect the Roma community. Kinga.
Yes, Eleanor, thank you. I can also connect this, of course, of how, US sort of can regain its relevance in the world and certainly in Europe and in our countries. And needless to say, this whole coronavirus and the pandemic has been somehow, in the United States, somehow it suffered its reputation, right, the biggest. But I think what the US can do now is to prioritize and show an example of delivering the vaccine first and foremost to those in need, and make sure that access to the vaccine doesn't become a class issue anywhere in the US and in the world. And this practical demonstration, of course, as I said, could somehow put the US also back into this distinctive ability to deliver on issues that matter for everybody in the world. I also think that Biden and the company can and should play a role in promoting public confidence in the vaccine's safety once the relevant institutions have given the green light on the vaccines and vaccines.
Thank you, Kinga. So we have one last video to play before we wrap up. So can we please play the contribution from Elvis Shokeri, the Executive Director of Roma in North Macedonia. My colleagues are laughing. I'm sorry if I've done that name terribly, but we'll go to the video.
When President Trump took over the office, the US foreign policy took a sudden, rather unexpected trajectory which made a lot of people upset and discouraged. The same was experienced within the domestic affairs and the people of the United States. Part of the fragile US foreign policy was experienced by the Roma in Europe. Populism, which resulted with anti-Roma politics, was reinforced in Europe by President Trump's authoritarian allies such as Viktor Orban, Jaroslav Kaczynski, Marian Kotleva, and many other racists which were hidden in the closet. The victory of Joe Biden generates an opportunity to mend the US foreign policy and send a strong message to populists worldwide that the United States was the first populist bastion which fell, and our struggle to fight populism as Roma continues in Europe.
So strong words to end our video segment on, the first populist bastion to fall. I hope it's true. We're coming towards the end, but I want to give each panelist an opportunity to just share some closing thoughts. Where to begin? Zeljko, you're on the far right of my screen. Why don't you come in?
Far right, yes.
Just off my screen, not of the politics.
As a far right on the screen, I will be then starting to fall, as Elvis would say. So I seen this interesting comment of Petar Konstantinov, who says, US have already traditions in minority active participation, but to what extent Europe and European institutions are ready to accept Roma in equal participation in social and political life? I think it's a very deep point. But I would say that, Petar, you are right, but it is not whether Europe and European institutions will accept or not, but what we will do to make them accept. And this is what I would close with in just a summary of what I would like people to take, at least from my points and many points that I built on because of the wisdom of my colleagues. First, I think we have to vote in an organized way, collectively, building the strength of our people who are not activists and who are not leaders. The second point is that we should not let populists, who will, in my view, become more aggressive, because this is their definitely a warning sign when Trump is out. We need to not allow them to use us as enemies of Bulgaria, enemies of Italy, enemies of Spain, enemies of Hungary. We need to build solidarity across the ethnic boundaries, because most of the issues that we suffer are the same issues that majority population suffers. Unemployment affects us as it affects them. It's just more dramatic impact on our population. We also shouldn't allow populists and far right confuse our own people and our own leaders by branding us and people like us as elitists. And this is a call to my human rights colleagues, colleagues fighting for equality, not only to work in the circles of Brussels and capitals, but that we work in our communities. The fourth point is that we have, besides claiming rights for our minority, we need to claim the reform, not going back, because for us the history was never beautiful, it was always painful. So we don't need to see Biden as a savior, as we shouldn't see any politician as a savior. We need to put our hopes in institutions where we have a place, and these institutions might be around elections and electoral conditions, where institutions that ensure them are impartial and not politicized, but also economic institutions. For example, Biden was part of the administration that, after the financial crisis, did not actually restructure significantly the world economy, and America has the power to influence that. Similarly, in Europe, economic policies were favoring the big business, big banks, because they were too big to fail. And in that sense, they practically continued extracting the resources from the smaller and less powerful. I hope that this crisis of COVID will not lead Biden and his partners in Europe to finish again with a conclusion that we need to have what Varoufakis calls socialism for the big business and austerity for the poor people. That's why I also say we need to advocate for economic institutions that are inclusive of minorities, because they were not inclusive. So this is just an opportunity with Biden and others, hopefully of similar kind politicians, to make them aware that going to the past and what was normal is not something we would accept. So with these points, I would close by saying to Peter, if we take this path, we will start establishing that tradition that is missing, because we cannot wait for somebody else to establish that tradition without us.
Kinga.
I will have to bring in another point, a new point, Eleanor, and I won't be very popular with you there, but I have to.
Vorrei parlare di un altro
punto.
Ma per un attimo vorrei.
Just a moment. We have. I'm sorry. I think some of our interpretation is coming into the main discussion, so we'll just give our colleagues a moment to see if they can mute that. Okay, try again, Kinga. Go ahead.
Okay, so Kamala Harris, right? We haven't had a chance to talk about her, but I do want to mention her, because I think there are many Harrises among the Roma women. And the question, similarly to what we previously brought up, is whether their voices can be heard or not. Roma women are strong in their careers, and they have a multitude of roles, and they can come. They understand, the hope and the responsibility that women and all women carry, minority women included. But access continues to be an issue, and the opportunities to voice the concerns and solutions will need to be consciously and purposefully nurtured and supported. And another point here on the Democratic Party, or any party, in fact, is that they cannot just remember women, and in this particular case, Black women and Romani women before the elections, and then sort of, put them back in the corner. Here I see, of course, a comparative with how parties in Europe tend to treat the Roma vote, right? And that needs to be changed too. Some will go out of their way prior to an election to make sure that they promise the world, and as soon as the election is done or the polls are
appena l'elezione si completa,
we need to fight this and not accept that Roma and minorities are often only used for immediate political gains.
Thank you, Kinga. And yes, thank you very much for bringing in Kamala Harris. That was remiss of me not to raise it before. So no need to apologize there. Neda, why don't you come in?
Thank you. I think we've discussed here the impact of the US election on Roma in Europe. It just shows how interconnected the world today is. And I think this is a key message for our European Roma movement to actually look at to resource itself of the power of the communities across Europe as it pushes for the reforms that needs to be done. And to quote Michelle Obama, not just because the lives of the Roma depend on it, but actually the future of Europe. And for the non-Roma friends, I just want to remind you that the racism and particularly anti-Gypsyism, it's very much present in our European societies, and it's not a problem that is somewhere in the US only. And I think if you are looking through the lens of Roma in any policies that you are trying to push, whether it's climate changes, digital misinformation, etc., through the lenses of Roma, it will illuminate really the flaws of the policies, and you can actually improve the work that you are doing. But unfortunately, this has not been the case. So this is my call for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Neda. And Mensur, we'll give you the last word.
Wow, that's quite difficult now. Some ideas. As US is concerned, domestically, I think it will very much depends from the Democratic Party's capacity to really embrace its progressive wing in a substantial way, especially when it comes to how poor and working people and minorities and ethnic and other minorities are treated, and also how they make substantive progress that reflects the strength of these communities. So that's one overall idea as far as US is concerned. Now, I started with the idea of many of us being concerned in 2016, and I would like to, now 4 years after, just to say that one thing that we will not do for sure as Roma in Europe is commit to a major mistake of not being vigilant. Too many people went to sleep before 2016. And, there were many lonely, isolated voices, not only from within Roma movement, but also other movements. I think that's something that we have realized now, or been in a situation in our lives to imagine how the worst situation can become even worse in a second, and how big impact that can have globally. And I cannot agree with Zeljko more with his point of the Roma being the biggest hope for themselves in Europe. At the same time, it is like David against Goliath, and I think we'll have to find many more friends and allies that care about the state capacity, the social trust, and also the kind of leadership we need in these new times to reflect more diverse societies, but also more unequal societies at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mensur, and thank you to all of our panelists. This was a really rich and very interesting discussion. I think we could have gone on longer. So thank you to everyone who listened in and bearing with us for our slight delay at the beginning. We hope to do more of these discussions in the near future, so please follow Roma Initiatives on Facebook for news about future events. And we would love to see you there. So thank you, and until next time, goodbye.
Thank you very much.